Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something really fundamental about how government works, government budgeting.
Right. And specifically, that common idea people have
Right.
that the government, like a household, has to get money first from taxes or loans.
Exactly. That it needs that income before it can spend. It just feels intuitive, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Feels like common sense. But, well, what if that core assumption isn't quite right? That's where modern monetary theory, or MMT, comes in with a, let's say, a challenging perspective.
Yeah, so our mission here is to explore this. Warren Mosler, an economist, he called it innocent fraud, #1, this belief that government must tax or borrow first.
Uh,
So the big question is, does a government that issues its own currency operate financially like you or me with our bank accounts? Let's try and unpack that.
okay, so the usual story we hear is government collects taxes, maybe sells some bonds, borrows money, and then it uses that pot of money for roads, schools, defense, whatever.
Makes perfect sense on the surface. You earn, then you spend.
Right. But MMT flips that. It says for a government that's monetarily sovereign, meaning it issues its own currency, like the U.S. with the dollar, and doesn't promise to exchange it for, say, gold.
Okay.
Its spending isn't actually limited by taxes or borrowing first. Operationally, it can always make payments in its own currency. It doesn't check its bank balance before spending, essentially.
Whoa, okay. So if taxes and borrowing aren't step one for funding, what are they for? And how does the spending actually happen? Let's start with taxes. We all pay them. Seems straightforward.
Yeah, you'd think so.
Uh,
But let's look closer. Say you pay your taxes with a check. What's happening behind the curtain?
Money leaves my account, goes to the government.
Sort of. Your bank account balance goes down, yes. And your bank's account at the Federal Reserve, its reserve account, also goes down.
Okay.
Simultaneously, the Treasury's account at the Fed goes up by that same amount.
Mm.
But as Musler points out, nothing physically went anywhere. It's all digital bookkeeping, really. Debits and credits shifting around within the Fed system.
Ah, okay. Like changing numbers in a spreadsheet, almost. Not like transferring a bag of cash. What if you do pay with cash, though? Less common, but...
Good point. Physical cash, those dollar bills are technically liabilities of the Federal Reserve. They're like little IOUs from the Fed.
Right.
When you pay taxes with cash, that liability, that IOU held by you, is returned to the issuer, the government Fed system. It's like the IOU is canceled out. They might literally shred old bills
Why shred them?
because the government, as the issuer of the dollar, doesn't need that specific piece of paper back to be able to spend later. It can always create new dollars electronically. The physical note itself isn't needed for its funding.
Okay, this is where my brain starts doing loops. If the government isn't using my tax dollars directly to fund its
Yeah.
spending, how does it spend? Where does the money come from?
This is the core of it. The government spends essentially by changing numbers in bank accounts upwards. It instructs the Federal Reserve to credit accounts.
How does that work? Like practically.
So imagine the government owes a contractor, say, $1 million for building something. The Treasury tells the Fed, credit the contractor's bank's reserve account with $1 million.
Okay.
The Fed does that, just keystrokes. Now, the contractor's bank has $1 million more in its account at the Fed. The bank then credits the contractor's own deposit account with $1 million.
So the money is just created
Right.
right then and there.
Exactly. It's created in the act of spending. It doesn't come out of some pre-filled pot funded by taxes.
That really does flip everything I thought I knew. Okay, let's try that analogy. People use the super parent coupons. Maybe that'll help cement it.
Yes, it's a really useful one. Imagine parents want their kids to do chores, so they invent super parent coupons.
Okay, got it. Monopoly money for chores.
Kind of.
Hmm.
And then they impose a tax. Let's say you need 10 coupons a week to get dessert.
Ah, so the kids need the coupons now. They have value.
Precisely. Now here's the key question. Do the parents, who are the only ones who can make these coupons, need to collect coupons back from the kids before they can pay them for mowing the lawn or whatever?
No, that wouldn't make sense. They have to give out the coupons first, right? So the kids can earn them.
Exactly. The parents, the issuers, have to spend the coupons into the little household economy first so the kids have something to pay the tax with. The parents can never, ever run out of coupons they themselves create.
Okay, I see the parallel. The U.S. government issues dollars, like the parents issue coupons.
Right.
So the government can't actually run out of dollars any more than the parents can run out of their homemade coupons. The household budget analogy for the government is, well, just wrong then.
According to MMT, yes. It's fundamentally misleading, which leads to the next big question. If taxes aren't primarily funding the spending, Why do we have them? What's the point?
Yeah, why go through all the hassle?
Well, MMT argues taxes serve several critical functions. Funding spending is maybe a secondary effect, not the main purpose. First, and this is crucial, taxes drive the currency.
How so?
Think back to the coupons. Why do the kids want them? Only because they need them for the dessert tax, right?
Yeah, otherwise they're just paper.
Exactly. The tax obligation creates the demand. Similarly, the requirement to pay taxes in U.S. dollars makes people, businesses, everyone need to get their hands on dollars.
Ah, so people work, sell things, offer services, partly to get the dollars needed to pay taxes. That ensures the dollars accepted.
Precisely. It underpins the whole system. Okay, second big purpose, regulating aggregate demand, managing the economy's temperature, you could say.
Like controlling inflation.
Exactly. If the economy's overheating, too much spending, chasing too few goods, prices rising too fast, the government can raise taxes.
Pulling money out of the economy.
Right. Takes spending power away from people and businesses, cools things down, fights inflation. On the flip side, if the economy's weak, lots of unemployment.
Cut taxes.
Cut taxes. Leave more money in people's pockets, hopefully stimulating spending and boosting the economy. So taxes create fiscal space. They make room for government spending without necessarily causing inflation.
So it's like an economic thermostat. Interesting. Any other big reasons for taxes?
Yeah, a couple more key ones. Taxes can be used for redistribution. Think progressive income taxes, where higher earners pay a larger share, or taxes on luxury goods. And they can be used to influence behavior, like carbon taxes to discourage pollution, or sin taxes on tobacco or alcohol to make them less appealing.
Got it. So taxes are really about managing the economy, driving the currency, influencing behavior, not just filling the government's wallet before it can spend.
That's the MMT perspective, yes.
Okay, what about the other side of that coin, borrowing? Selling treasury bonds. We hear constantly about the national debt, about borrowing from China. Surely that's funding the government.
Well, again, the MMT view is different. Selling bonds isn't primarily about funding spending in an operational sense. It's more about managing the banking system. Remember, bank reserves.
Yeah, the accounts banks hold at the Fed. We touched on that before.
Right. So when the government spends more than it taxes, runs a deficit, it adds net reserves to the banking system. Remember, spending credits those reserve accounts.
Okay, so deficit spending increases reserves overall.
Yes. Now, if banks suddenly have tons of these extra reserves they don't need for regulatory requirements or clearing payments, they might try to lend them out to each other really cheaply.
Driving down interest rates?
Exactly. Driving down the overnight interbank lending rate, the Fed funds rate, potentially below the Fed's target.
Ah, so the Fed wants to control that rate.
Yes, for monetary policy.
Yeah.
So selling treasury bonds is a way to drain those excess reserves back out of the system. Banks and investors swap their reserves, which pay little or no interest, for bonds, which pay interest.
So bond sales are basically offering banks a better parking spot for their money, helping the Fed hit its interest rate target.
That's a good way to put it. Mops up excess reserves and the national debt. It's essentially the total amount of these interest-bearing treasury bonds outstanding. Think of it like savings accounts the private sector holds at the Fed.
Wow. So not a giant credit card bill in the same way we think about personal debt.
Not really, no. It's a record of how much the government has spent into the economy that hasn't yet been taxed back out, and which is currently being held in the form of interest-paying government securities.
This leads to maybe the biggest, most controversial implication. Can a government like the U.S. actually go bankrupt, run out of dollars?
Involuntarily, in its own currency. According to MMT, the answer is no.
Because it creates the dollars.
Because it's the issuer. It can always, always create more dollars to pay any bill that is denominated in dollars. It can't be forced into default on debts in its own currency unless it chooses to.
The debt ceiling. All the political fights about it, doesn't that show there's a limit?
That's a self-imposed constraint.
Yeah.
It's purely political. It's like our coupon parents suddenly declaring, we can't issue more than 1,000 coupons, ever. Even if kids need more to pay their dessert tax or the house needs cleaning.
That's like putting handcuffs on yourself, essentially. Not a real operational limit.
Exactly. It's a political choice, not an economic necessity baked into the system.
You mentioned Stephanie Bell Kelton earlier and an idea about money being destroyed and created. Can you expand on that thought? It sounded quite radical.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point she makes. Think about what happens when taxes are paid or bonds are bought. People or banks use high-powered money, that's central bank money, so reserves or physical cash,
Okay.
to make the payment. From the perspective of the private sector, that high-powered money is now gone. It's been returned to the government, effectively removing it from circulation or consolidating it on the government side of the ledger.
So it's destroyed in a sense from the private sector's view.
Right. But when the government spends, it creates new high-powered money, new reserves,
Yeah.
which become new deposits. So Kelton argues the idea that the money destroyed by taxes or bond sales somehow sits in a pot waiting to finance future spending is misleading. All sovereign government spending is fundamentally an act of creating new central bank money.
That really challenges the whole tax and spend sequence. It suggests it's more like spend than tax or issue bonds.
Wow, it's a paradigm shift for sure.
Okay, let's try and sum up the core ideas from this deep dive. There's a lot to process here.
Absolutely. So first, big point. A monetarily sovereign government spending isn't operationally constrained by its tax receipts or borrowing. It spends by crediting accounts. It creates money when it spends.
Right. Second, taxes are absolutely vital, but not primarily for funding federal spending. Their main jobs are to make people need the currency and to manage economic demand, especially keeping inflation in check. Plus, redistribution and influencing behavior.
Third takeaway. Selling government bonds or borrowing isn't mainly about financing spending either. It's primarily a tool for managing bank reserves and helping the central bank hit its interest rate targets. The national debt is the result of this, not a source of funds beforehand.
And finally, perhaps the most striking point, a government that issues its own currency cannot be forced into bankruptcy in that currency. Things like the debt ceiling are political choices, not inescapable economic realities.
Which leaves us with a really important thought for you, the listener, to chew on. If the government that issues the currency isn't like a household, if it doesn't face the same kind of financial constraints we often assume, what does that really mean?
Yeah, what are the implications?
How should that change the conversation when we talk about tackling huge challenges like climate change or investing in healthcare, education, infrastructure? If the primary constraint isn't finding the money, what are the real constraints? Things like available resources, labor, potential inflation.
It really encourages you to question the narratives we always hear about government affordability, doesn't it? Something to definitely reflect on.